Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel, and today I'm going to be doing another makeup mystery video. This is basically where I sit down, I do my makeup, and I talk about something murder, mystery, or like true crime related. So today we're going to be talking about the case of Derek Bentley. I remember first hearing about this case when I was in high school actually, when I was doing my GCSEs. I did drama as a GCSE, and we kind of looked into the case of Derek Bentley to do like a performance piece around it. We did a whole like piece based on capital punishment, and that is basically what we're going to be talking about today. Before we begin, I just want to give a little disclaimer. This video is for educational purposes only, and I mean no disrespect about any of the people I will be talking about in today's video. It is absolutely boiling today, so if I get a bit sweaty, please bear with. So Derek Bentley, he was born Derek William Bentley, and he was born on the 30th of June 1933. Derek Bentley was one of the last people in Britain to be killed by capital punishment. Just in case you don't know what capital punishment is, capital punishment in the UK is basically the death penalty. We don't do that anymore in England, but we did it for years, and it was officially abolished in 1969. So Derek Bentley, he was born in Southwark in London, and his parents were called William and Lillian Bentley. Derek also had an older sister. She was called Iris. So growing up, Bentley's family, they were pleasant people, they were stable, they weren't like rich, but you know, they had enough money to survive on. So they were just an average family, but Derek actually suffered with some health and development issues. So when Derek was a child, he actually suffered with some serious injuries. His parents had said that when Derek was younger, he had actually got a broken nose, and then since then he'd suffered 3 fits. In one of those fits, Derek had actually almost nearly died from choking. From then on, Derek was intellectually impaired. He would continue to be completely illiterate throughout all of his life, and he really struggled at school. When Derek was 15 years old, his mental intellect was actually that of a 10-year-old's. He did an IQ test when he was 15, and he actually scored 66 years old, which is the mental age of a 10-year-old. So Derek attended Norbury Manor Secondary Modern School in 1944. Wow, that is a tongue tie. So Derek failed his 11 plus exams. We don't do that in England anymore. I think they refer to SATs, because we have SATs now, but I think they used to have the 11 plus exams. So before actually leaving the school, Derek and another boy were arrested for theft, and this was in March 1948. So 6 months later, he was actually sentenced to serve 3 years at Kingswood Approved School, which is near Bristol. So while Derek was at this Kingswood training school, they actually ran diagnostic tests on Derek. This was when they discovered that his IQ was of 66, and also they found out his reading age was of a 4-year-old when he was 15. He was just a very slow guy. He just struggled with learning. When Derek was at Kingswood, the staff would report him to be lazy, indifferent, voluble, and the wise guy type. Dennis was examined on the 16th of November 1949, and he was actually found to be epileptic. Bentley was released from Kingswood on the 28th of July 1950. And for the rest of 1950, Dennis became somewhat of a recluse. Dennis would rarely venture outside of his house, but he eventually broke this isolation in January 1951. So in March 1951, Dennis was actually employed by a furniture removal company. So he was here for about a year until he was forced to leave the job because he had actually hurt his back in an injury in March 1952. So a couple of months later, in May 1952, Derek was actually taken on by the Croydon Corporation as a dustbin man. However, just a month later, Dennis was actually demoted to street sweeping because of his unsatisfactory performance. And then after that, after a month of street sweeping, Dennis was fired, and he remained unemployed for the rest of his life. So another very, very important name in this case, we're going to be introduced to Christopher Craig. He is a very, very important part in this story. So Christopher Craig actually went to the same secondary school as Derek. When Christopher Craig was 16 years old, he met Derek. Derek was 19 years old, and they became friends, I suppose. So Christopher Craig was as some people referred to him, a bad un. He was a bad guy, he was bad company for Derek to have. He came from a family with criminal connections and was knowing in the ways of the underworld. That was just like a reference I found from a source and I thought it was really funny. So Derek quickly became really good friends with Chris. And Derek's parents did not want Derek hanging around with Chris. He knew that Christopher Craig was really bad company and they did not want their child hanging around with him. Derek's parents even told him, you know, you're not allowed to hang around with Chris, but this didn't stop them and they still, you know, would meet up behind Derek's parents' backs. Okay, so now I've given you a little bit of insight into Derek and Chris's background and life. I'm just gonna jump straight into the crime. So Derek saw Chris as like a boss. He kind of saw him as his boss more than like his friend, I suppose. He would always look for approval from Chris all the time. He would like look to him on know like what to do. He would ask him what to do. He kind of like stayed around him and did what he did to, you know, kind of be cool. And Derek would literally do anything that Chris asked him to do, like literally anything. And I think Christopher Craig really took advantage of Derek's, you know, mentality. On the night of the 2nd of November 1952, it was a Sunday, Derek was just sat at home with his parents. He was just watching TV, and then around 8 p.m. Chris came over. His mum answered the door. Chris was asking, you know, for Derek to come out, and his mum said, Derek's not at home, he's actually at the pictures, or the cinema. Derek had indeed been to the cinema that evening at around 7 o'clock, and Christopher Craig left. So Chris left, and then a couple of other guys called Norman Parsley and Frank Fazy, they called again asking for Derek. His mum answered the door, and, you know, she again said, Derek isn't here. When his mum told Derek who had called, he immediately left and ran up the street, you know, to chase after them. They all ended up walking to a paper shop together, like a newsagent's, and that is where they met Chris. Chris was just stood on the corner of this paper shop. So the other guys left, and it was just Derek and Chris at this point, and they got on a bus to go to Croydon. So when they got to Croydon, Chris actually led them to this warehouse. And they got there, and Chris basically just told Derek, right, we're gonna rob this warehouse. So Christopher gave Derek a knuckle duster, and then some sources say he also gave him a knife, but then some sources say he just had the knuckle duster. Christopher actually had a knife and a gun on his possession. So Derek and Chris, they get to this warehouse and they climb over a gate to basically like get inside. At 9:15 p.m, they climb over this gate and neighbours actually spot them going into this building, so they call the police. Chris and Derek then, after they'd been over the gate, they climbed up a drain pipe and then they were on the top of the warehouse roof. So obviously not long after the police were called, they arrived, and Derek and Chris had basically not even like gone into this building yet. That's how quick they got there. So when the police arrived, they both hid behind the lift housing on top of the roof, and they waited for about 10 minutes. The police knew exactly where they were, and then after about 10 minutes of trying to hide, Chris started taunting the police officers, apparently. So the police ended up cornering both of these guys on the roof. A man called Detective Sergeant Frederick Fairfax, he climbed up the drainage pipe as well, and he managed to grab hold of Derek, but Derek actually like shook him loose. Once Derek had managed to slip loose of Frederick, Frederick turned to Chris and he told him to hand over the gun. This bit is really important, alright? So Chris obviously didn't hand over the gun, and Derek shouted, "Let him have it, Chris." After that, Chris fired. He struck Frederick in the shoulder, and Derek, at any point during any of this, Derek didn't use his weapon at all. So this sentence has really caused a lot of confusion with the case. It's such an ambiguous statement, and some people think that Derek was saying, you know, let him have the gun, just give it to him. Or was Derek saying, you know, let him have it, shoot him? So another group of police officers arrived at the scene, and they also went onto the roof. Derek was then arrested by the police. Chris had not been caught yet. Chris was still on the roof, still, you know, taunting the police officers. The first police officer officer to reach the roof, he was called Police Constable Sidney Miles. He was immediately shot in the head and killed by Chris. Derek wasn't even with Chris at this point. He had been arrested. He had been taken away. He had no say in this murder. So then obviously Chris was just like freaking out on the roof, was just trying to shoot all of the police officers. And at this point he'd actually ran out of ammunition. He was being cornered, he didn't have any ammunition left, and he didn't really want to be arrested. He decided to jump off of the roof into a greenhouse, and when he landed he fractured his spine and his left wrist, and he had to be taken to hospital. Following day, on the 3rd of November 1952, Chris and Derek were both charged with the murder of PC Sidney Miles. They were tried by the jury in London between the 9th of December and the 11th of December 1952. So of course the two cases were both very different. The case against Chris, who was the shooter, this was clear, and it was later described as very strong, and that any verdict other than guilty of murder would have been perverse. It would have been injustice if he wasn't found guilty, because he literally killed someone. So basically, Chris killed a man, he was obviously found guilty, he literally murdered someone. So the actual case about Derek Bentley, like his actual case, was so much more complex and difficult. So to basically succeed in proving him guilty, they had to prove that Derek was party to a common purpose. So a agreement with Chris that they would use any violence necessary to avoid arrest, which is kind of what Chris did, but Derek was arrested like straight away. They also had to prove that Derek knew Chris had a gun, and they focused heavily on the statement that Derek said, "Let him have it, Chris." This was a huge part of the case. So Derek denies saying "let him have it, Chris," and he also denied even knowing that Chris had a gun to begin with. So at this time in 1952, burglary attempt and murder was a capital offence, meaning it would result in the death penalty. However, minors under the age of 18 could not be sentenced to death. They could not receive capital punishment. So even though Chris was immediately found guilty and he fired the final fatal shot, Derek faced the death penalty if he was convicted. Christopher Craig would never, had the death penalty because he was 16 years old. So the Crown also, when I say the Crown, I just mean the Crown Court. So the Crown also relied upon a voluntary statement signed by Bentley. Bentley could not write, he was illiterate, so his words were actually transcribed by one of the police officers. In his statement, it contains some pretty damning evidence. There was a sentence in his statement that reads, "I did not know he was going to use the gun." This proves that Derek knew Chris had a gun. And as I said earlier, this was not good for Derek's case. There was actually some disagreement over if Bentley was actually fit to stand trial due to his mental capacity. So the principal medical officer responsible was Dr. Matheson, and he referred Derek to Dr. Hill. That's easy to say. So he was a psychiatrist at the Maudsley Hospital, and Dr. Hill reported that Bentley was illiterate and he was of low intelligence and he was almost borderline retarded. This is literally what this guy said, but I suppose different time. So even though it was said that he did have low intelligence, Derek wasn't suffering from epilepsy at the time of the, offence. And it was concluded that Derek was not a feeble-minded person. They basically concluded that Derek was sane and he was fit to plead and stand trial. English law at this time did not recognise the concept of diminished responsibility due to intellectual disability. So this would mean the fact that Derek might have not known what he was doing because he couldn't really understand it. This just wasn't applied. This didn't count in this case. Also, criminal insanity was a thing in this time, and that could have stopped Derek from getting the death penalty. But Derek wasn't insane. At the end of the trial, the jury took a total of 75 minutes to decide that both Chris and Derek were guilty. They were found guilty of the murder of Sidney Miles. So Bentley was sentenced to death. Christopher Craig was just arrested. So Christopher was eventually released in May 1963 after serving 10 years in jail, and then 2 years later he was married and eventually he became a plumber. That is crazy. That is crazy. At this time, the death penalty in England was hanging. You would be hanged. Originally, Derek was actually scheduled to be hanged on the 30th of December 1952. This was actually postponed to allow for an appeal. So Derek's lawyers, they actually filed appeals highlighting the ambiguities in the case. That, you know, they weren't consistent. They weren't like certain that Derek was completely guilty of this crime. So, you know, the things like Derek's mental age and the fact he didn't actually fire the shot. They wanted to try and get an appeal for him. So his appeal was heard on the 13th of January 1953 and it was unfortunately unsuccessful. When his appeal was turned down, Derek's life was placed in the hands of Home Secretary David Maxwell Fyfe. So he had an idea that he could recommend Queen Elizabeth to exercise the royal prerogative of mercy to convert his death sentence to life in prison, because the Queen can do that. However, this did not happen. So at 9 a.m. on the 28th of January 1953, Derek was hanged. He was hanged at Wandsworth Prison in London by a guy called Albert Pierpoint. So following the execution, there was indeed a public sense of unease about the decision. This resulted in a long campaign to secure a posthumous pardon, basically a pardon after someone had been killed, like, you know, to let them off saying, you know what, we got it wrong. So throughout all of this, Derek's family, they were really trying to fight for some justice for him. They were like, he did not deserve to die for this. He literally didn't even do the crime. His parents actually died in 1970, still trying to fight for justice for Derek. So Derek's sister, Iris, she took over the campaign. In March 1966, Derek's remains were moved from the prison and they were actually re-entered in Croydon Cemetery, where he was buried with his family. This was not a pardon though, he was still technically held accountable for killing someone. So on the 29th of July 1993, so we're talking many years after Derek had been killed. So on the 29th of July 1933, Derek was granted a royal pardon. This was in respect to the death passed upon him and that was actually carried out. However, this did not quash in any way his conviction of murder. He had been pardoned, but he was still kind of blamed by the law still, if that makes sense. Anyway, eventually, on the 30th of July 1998, the Court of Appeal quashed Derek's conviction for murder. Unfortunately, Derek's sister Iris had died a year before that of cancer, and so her daughter Maria, she carried on her mum's campaign. You know, she'd never met Derek, but she strongly believed in the campaign and she finally was able to get some sort of justice for Derek. When this happened, Christopher Craig was 62 years old, he was still alive, and he issued a statement welcoming the pardon for Derek. He released a statement saying his innocence has now been proved. Throughout his life, he apologised multiple times to Derek's families and Sydney Miles's families, you know, for his actions. He also apologised to his own family because over the years they'd suffered a lot of press intrusion in their lives. So this sort of sense of injustice that Derek Bentley faced, even though it was a horrible thing that happened, it really strengthened the opposition of the death penalty, and is one of the main reasons why the death penalty was abolished. And that is the case of Derek Bentley. So it's a pretty sad one, but I think it's really interesting and important to know about the history of the world and the history of the country that I'm from. But yeah, that is everything. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you have an absolutely wonderful day and you're not absolutely sweating like I am. Stay safe and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!